Welcome to Should Have Known It, where we present 15-minute videos of things you definitely should have known. Hi, welcome to Shoulda Known It. I'm MS Aoki, and today's topic is the open loop. Her name was Bluma Zeigarnik. She was a student of Kurt Lewin at the University of Berlin, and Lewin was one of the first psychologists to think seriously about tension, about the motivational states the mind generates when it wants something and hasn't gotten it yet. The observation in that Viennese restaurant was his, actually. He pointed it out to Zeigarnik and said, "Go test it." She took it back to the lab. She gave subjects a series of small tasks, solving puzzles, making clay figures, stringing beads, and interrupted half of them before they could finish. When she asked subjects to recall the tasks afterward, completed tasks were remembered at roughly half the rate of interrupted ones. Interrupted tasks were recalled, on average, about twice as well. That ratio became known as the Zeigarnik Effect. It's worth pausing on what interrupted meant in her setup. These weren't traumatic interruptions. She would simply say, "Let's move on to the next task," mid-activity. That mild disruption, just the absence of a satisfying ending, was enough to change how the brain encoded the memory. The completion itself was doing cognitive work that we hadn't appreciated before. Here's what's genuinely surprising about the original numbers. The ratio wasn't subtle. In her 1927 paper, the interrupted task recall advantage was roughly 1.9 to 1. Across different subject groups, different task types, different interruption timings, the brain reliably clung harder to things it hadn't finished. Not slightly harder, almost twice as hard. To understand why this happens, you need a rough map of what working memory is actually doing. Working memory isn't storage, it's more like a whiteboard. It holds a small number of active items, roughly 4 chunks at once according to most modern estimates, and it maintains them through a kind of continuous rehearsal. Your brain keeps refreshing those items so they don't fade. The question Zeigarnik's work raises is, what gets refreshed and what? Kurt Lewin's tension model gives you the answer. When you start a task, you create what he called a quasi-need, a goal state that the brain treats almost like biological hunger. Your working memory allocates attention to that quasi-need because it genuinely expects to resolve it. The loop is open, and open loops get priority. When the task ends, the quasi-need is satisfied, the tension releases, and the brain stops allocating. The memory becomes ordinary. This is why the waiter could hold 6 orders in his head without writing them down. Every one of those was an open loop, a quasi-need demanding attention, but the moment the bill was paid and the table cleared, the brain said resolved and released the thread. It's not that he forgot, it's that forgetting was the correct response. The system worked exactly as designed. The modern neuroscience fills in some detail here. The prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in maintaining goal representations. It's essentially the part of the brain that holds the "I haven't finished this yet" flag. And there's evidence from neuroimaging that unfinished goals activate the prefrontal cortex even when you're not consciously thinking about them. The open loop hums in the background, it costs something, even when you're trying to do something else entirely. Here's where it turns dark. And this is the part most summaries of the Zeigarnik effect leave out entirely. The original finding was about memory. But what happens when the open loop is not a clay modeling task? What happens when it's a difficult conversation you haven't had? A project you've been avoiding for 3 weeks? A mistake you made that you haven't fully processed? The brain treats those with the same logic. Open loop, keep refreshing, maintain the tension. That's rumination, not a character flaw, not a failure of willpower. It is at the mechanical level the Zeigarnik effect operating on an unresolved goal state. Your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, holding the loop open, keeping it available, waiting for resolution. The problem is that some loops don't close easily. A grief that doesn't have a clear ending. A relationship that ended without explanation. A career question with no obvious answer. The system that makes waiters great at remembering orders becomes the same system that keeps you awake at 2 a.m. A 1993 study by Roy Baumeister and Leonard Newman extended Zeigarnik's work into exactly this territory. They found that people intrusive think about unfinished goals not just remember them better, but mentally return to them repeatedly and involuntarily. The brain wasn't waiting to be asked. It was inserting the unresolved item into awareness, whether the person wanted it or not. That's not a memory effect anymore. That's a motivational system that can get stuck. So how do you close a loop that you can't resolve right now? Here's the piece of the research that genuinely surprised me when I first found it. A 2011 study by E.J. Messicampo and Roy Baumeister, titled Consider It Done, found that you don't actually have to complete a task to stop the brain from ruminating on it. You just have to make a plan. Their subjects were given an unfinished task that kept intruding into a second, unrelated task. Classic Zeigarnik interference. When subjects were allowed to write down a specific plan for when and how they would complete the unfinished task, the intrusion stopped, not reduced, stopped. The brain accepted a written, specific plan as a provisional close. It was satisfied, at least enough to release the working memory back to the present moment. The critical word in that finding is specific. A vague intention, I'll get to it eventually, didn't work. What worked was this task, this specific next step, at this particular time. When subjects wrote, I will call Dan at 9 a.m. Tuesday about the contract, their performance on the current task improved measurably. The brain needed a credible commitment before it would let go of the loop. This is why the GTD system, David Allen's Getting Things Done, which predates this study by a decade, works the way it does. Allen's core principle is capture everything into a trusted system. And he's intuited, without using this vocabulary, that the brain's open loop maintenance is expensive. He calls it open loops explicitly. He arrived at the solution before the science had formally confirmed the mechanism. Now, let's use this offensively. If the Zeigarnik effect means your brain clings to unfinished things, you can deliberately create a small, unfinished thing at the end of a work session to pull your brain forward into the next one. Ernest Hemingway described this technique without naming it. He would stop writing mid-sentence in the middle of a scene he knew how to continue, so that the next morning he would have a running start. He was manufacturing an open loop. The practical version of this is more powerful than it sounds. When you stop mid-sentence, not mid-chapter, not at a natural pause, but in the literal middle of a thought you were building, you create a quasi-need that the brain will maintain overnight. Many writers report that working this way produces a qualitatively different re-entry into the work, not where was I, but something closer to, oh right, I was saying that, and the momentum is already there, the loop was never cold. You can extend this to any knowledge work. If you're researching a complex topic, don't close all your tabs before you stop for the day. Leave one open, half-read, mid-argument. If you're in the middle of a design problem, sketch a partial solution on paper and leave it on your desk rather than putting it away in a drawer. You're not being disorganized, you're being strategically incomplete. You are running the Zeigarnik system in your favor. There's also a version of this that works in conversation. If you're teaching someone or giving a presentation, ending a session with an open question rather than a clean summary keeps the loop running in your audience. So, the question we haven't answered yet is why the effect reverses under stress, and that's where we'll pick up next time. Their brains take that unresolved question home. They'll be slightly more ready to engage when you return to it. That's not manipulation, it's architecture. Here's a complication that the popular accounts gloss over. The Zeigarnik effect doesn't work equally well when you have too many open loops competing simultaneously. Zeigarnik's original results held for small numbers of tasks. When researchers tested subjects under conditions of cognitive overload, too many simultaneous quasi-needs, the advantage disappeared and in some cases reversed. The brain can maintain a few open loops. It cannot maintain 47. This is the modern problem. The typical knowledge worker in 2025 is carrying not 4 competing open loops, but something closer to dozens. Emails flagged but not answered, projects started but not advanced, conversations that need follow-up, decisions deferred without a date attached. Under that load, the brain doesn't allocate priority well. It doesn't give the important loops more rehearsal than the trivial ones. It just tries to hold all of them and fails, producing anxiety without focus, awareness of burden without clarity about action. The perverse result is that the same cognitive architecture that gave Zeigarnik's lab subjects a memory advantage becomes, under overload, a source of diffuse stress with no signal value. You feel like everything is urgent. Nothing is urgent in a useful way. The system is still running. It's still dutifully maintaining all those loops, but it's maintaining them in noise rather than in clarity. The waiter with 40 tables doesn't remember every order better. He makes mistakes. So the real prescription isn't create more open loops. It's maintain a small number of deliberate open loops for generative purposes and close or externalize everything else. The brain is not a good list. It is a good engine. Give it 1 or 2 unresolved tensions worth ruminating on, and it will work on them even when you're asleep. Give it 50, and it will spin. There's a ritual dimension to this that's worth naming. Completion is not just a cognitive event. It's something the brain seems to need to experience as completion. This is why partial credit doesn't fully satisfy the quasi need, why almost done doesn't feel like done, why projects you finished 90% of haunt you like projects you've barely started. The final 10% carries disproportionate psychological weight because it's the 10% where closure actually happens. This has real implications for how you structure your work. If you routinely leave things at 90%, which is extremely common among high output people who move to the next challenge before the current one is fully put to bed, you are accumulating a kind of cognitive debt. Each near completion is a loop that looks resolved but isn't. The brain knows the difference. It doesn't count the 90% as closed. It keeps the flag raised. What's interesting is that closure rituals can substitute for literal completion in some cases. A researcher named Jia Lu found that even symbolic endings, like drawing a single final line under a list or saying aloud, "I'm done with this for now," can reduce intrusive thinking about a task. The brain will accept a ritual marker as a soft close if the ritual is consistent and intentional. That's a strange and useful thing to know. You can teach your brain what done looks like. Let me try to put all of this together honestly. The Zeigarnik Effect is not a superpower. It's a feature of a brain that evolved to finish things, to hunt, to gather, to complete social transactions in small groups, and that feature runs somewhat baffled in the environment we've built. The brain is doing its best with a cognitive architecture that wasn't designed for inbox 0 or 5 simultaneous projects or a creative practice plus a day job. What Zeigarnik's work actually gives you is legibility. If you can see the mechanism, the quasi-need, the working memory allocation, the tension that persists until resolution, you can work with it rather than against it. You can choose which loops to leave open deliberately and which ones to close aggressively. You can write down the specific plan that satisfies the brain's demand for commitment. You can end the session mid-sentence on purpose. You can stop accumulating provisional closures that don't actually close. Bluma Zeigarnik published her paper in 1927 and spent the next 50 years working in Moscow on clinical psychology, specifically on how cognitive disruption affects people with mental illness. She never became a household name. Most people who use her effect every day, even people who know the name, don't know she lived to 81, or that she trained generations of Soviet psychologists, or that she described herself, late in her life, as someone who always worked best when she left a problem slightly unfinished before sleep. She was running the experiment on herself, and she knew it. The open loop is not a bug. It is the brain saying, "This matters, finish it." The only question is whether you're the one choosing which loops stay open, or whether you've simply stopped noticing that you're carrying them. That's the whole thing. A Viennese waiter, a Soviet psychologist, and a system in your head that's been running since long before either of them noticed it. Use it well. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me and learning something new. Until next time, click like and subscribe.